Although the Allied invasion of mainland Europe in June of 1944 would ultimately prove to be a success, it did not come so without great cost. As prior to the invasion fleet even setting sail for Normandy, over 700 American servicemen had already lost their lives whilst preparing for it. These deaths easily avoidable, and covered up by their superiors in an effort to prevent preparations for the operation becoming known to their enemy. As the landing sites for the planned invasion of France became more defined, Allied planners searched for comparable areas upon the UK mainland where their forces could train. They would eventually settle on a small stretch of land along the South Devon coastline, as being closest in nature to the beaches of Normandy. The area in question possessing a series of shale and gravel beaches, which then progressed up into a countryside that was partitioned by thick lines of hedgerow. Thus it was that in November of 1943, the residents of Devon's South Hams district were summoned to a meeting and informed they would have to leave their homes. Any protest was quickly silenced, with a warning their homes and villages were needed for a top-secret mission, which would ultimately contribute to ending the war. The British Army quickly moved to take possession of over 30,000 acres of land, displacing the inhabitants of 6 rural parishes in the process. Many of the 3,000 residents had never left their communities for any significant amount of time, and could not cope with the unexpected hardship that had been imposed upon them. Several elderly parishioners died shortly after being evicted from their homes, and there was at least one documented suicide, caused by the emotional trauma of the move. But by 15th of December, a ring of steel had been put in place around the district, which allowed the US forces designated to land on Utah Beach to commence training. From the outset of the exercises in and around Lyme Bay, it became clear to the American commanders there were severe deficiencies in the training of their men. Many were young and had never ventured far beyond the borders of their hometowns, let alone having left the North American continent to travel to the other side of the world. Few had fired a weapon in anger before, and more worryingly still, a large number did not know how to swim, which represented a major issue when planning an amphibious assault. In order to counter this, 2 measures were taken, the first being the implementation of back-to-back exercises, each designed to learn from the lessons of the last. The second being the deployment of live artillery and ammunition during the exercises, in order to make them as realistic as possible. But far from improving the deployability of their forces, these measures would ultimately only lead to further issues amongst the soldiers involved. By the end of the first 2 exercises, codenamed Duck and Beaver, a small number of servicemen had been killed, severely denting the morale of those involved. The American commanders expressed optimism that such losses would naturally decrease by the inception of the 3rd exercise, which had been designated Tiger and would take place in April of 1944. Little realizing they were about to preside over one of the greatest losses of life the US Army would experience during World War II. Operation Tiger had been planned to take place across the 27th and 28th of April, 1944, and to involve a full simulation of the proposed assault on Utah Beach. Across the 2 days, each morning a convoy of landing support ships would approach Slapton Beach, following a sustained artillery bombardment. Each ship would be carrying several hundred infantrymen and Sherman tanks, which would then pour forth to assault and take control of the waiting beach defences. On the evening of 26th of April, the first convoy left its home ports and spent the evening circling the Devon coast in order to simulate a nighttime channel crossing. But as they approached Slapton Beach at 07:30 on the morning of the 27th, the occupants of the landing craft were confused at the absence of any artillery bombardment. To their horror, it was only as the troops began to run up the beaches that the Navy ships behind them in the bay opened fire. It would later transpire that the US Navy had elected to delay the exercise by 1 hour, but had neglected to inform their Army counterparts. Worse still, the 2 service arms were using separate radio frequencies, meaning it took several precious minutes to countermand the order to open fire. As a result, an unknown number of American soldiers were killed in the bombardment, with rumours abounding it amounted to several hundred. Undeterred, those in charge of the exercise resolved to push on, conscious the actual invasion was by now only weeks away. With the incident suppressed, that same evening 9 further LSTs set off from Plymouth and Brixham harbours, before forming a convoy and starting to circle the beach. Not knowing as they did so, they too were about to fall prey to the criminally poor planning of their superiors. With news of the deaths from the morning's exercise suppressed, all the soldiers aboard convoy T4 could rely upon was rumours that had emerged during the day. They were aware that something had gone very wrong and that casualties had been sustained, but isolated in their ships for the day, the true scale of the losses had been hidden. Had they known this, and how vulnerable they themselves were to enemy attack at that moment, they would likely have felt even worse. As it was taking place within the English Channel, protection from naval attack for Exercise Tiger fell within the remit of the British and not the US Navy. With the forces of the Kriegsmarine having been severely weakened during the course of the previous 5 years, attacks upon the British coastline itself were rare. But they were not unheard of, as there was still a significant number of U-boats operating in the English Channel. In addition to this, several squadrons of E-boat torpedo craft were located at the captured French ports, and these would venture forth each evening in search of prey. Protection against these fast-moving vessels was provided by a squadron of British torpedo craft, who were expected to intercept and then drive away their German counterparts. In addition to this, 2 Royal Navy ships were assigned to protect the convoys as a last line of defence, HMS Scimitar and HMS Azalea. Unfortunately for the American ships that evening, HMS Scimitar had suffered damage when one of the LSTs had collided with her in port that morning. Capable of now only operating at low speeds to avoid flooding from a wide gash in her hull, the destroyer's captain had withdrawn from the convoy to seek repair. After several hours in search of a replacement, the aging HMS Saladin was ordered to leave her patrol area further along the coast and to join up with the convoy. But the significant distance she would need to travel meant she would not arrive until the early hours, temporarily leaving HMS Azalea as the convoy's sole protector. Worse still, just as had dogged the exercise earlier that day, the British and American ships were operating on different radio frequencies. So when reports were passed that E-boats had been sighted crossing the channel, these were not then passed on to the convoy itself. While still unaware of the scale of the coming invasion, it had not escaped the attention of the German commanders something was afoot on the Devon coast. The E-boat patrols had reported progressively heavier amounts of Allied shipping since the start of the year, suggesting some form of extended operation was underway. As a result, the commanders of the torpedo boats were ordered to amass as much intelligence as possible in order to guide a German response to the action. That evening, Captain Gunter Raab had briefed his fellow commanders in the 9th E-boat flotilla before they'd left their berths in Cherbourg. Over the next few hours, the German craft skillfully evaded the British patrols sent to stop them, arriving off the Devon coast just after midnight. Almost immediately, Raab sighted a slow-moving convoy of large ships steaming along the moonlit horizon ahead of him. Looking through his binoculars, he could see that these were large transport vessels and appeared to be heavily laden. More importantly, they were travelling in a straight line, unlike the other convoys he'd previously encountered, which had been zigzagging, in order to avoid the risk of torpedo attack. Suspecting that fate would be unlikely to offer him another opportunity, Raab gave orders for the 9 E-boats of his patrol to split into 2 groups. For the next hour, the torpedo boats slowly manoeuvred to a point either side of the convoy, all the time searching for any sign of escort ships. Before just after 1 a.m., Raab gave the order to attack, and the German E-boats came screaming out of the darkness, directly into the midst of the waiting American transports. The first sign the Americans knew of the incoming attack was the sighting of flares being fired by approaching ships, reported by the lookouts aboard the LSTs. But even at this point, it was assumed the flares were part of the exercise, or were communications being passed between Royal Navy ships. Regardless, with the majority of the soldiers aboard the ships resting below decks, it was only their crews and the lookouts aware of the unfolding situation. Having failed to detect the E-boats on its radar, the bridge crew of HMS Azalea watched on in horror as the convoy ahead of them was consumed by a hail of gunfire and explosions. As dark shapes passed between the ships at high speed, streams of tracer fire erupted from them, crisscrossing the decks of the lumbering transports. Unable to effectively track the attackers, or to depress their weapons fully, the tired and inexperienced gunners aboard the LSTs blindly opened fire. The orange traces of their heavy machine guns merging with those of the Germans, sweeping the decks of their fellow LSTs and killing several of the crew. At the same time, pairs of torpedoes began to detonate against the hulls of the American ships. Within minutes, 2 had exploded and rolled onto their sides, before disappearing under the water. Reticent to open fire for fear of hitting the remaining LSTs, the captain of HMS Azalea watched on mutely as a 3rd American ship then caught fire. It was only after another hour that the German attack ended, the E-boats roaring back off into the night, leaving behind them a sea of screaming and drowning soldiers. By the break of dawn, several hundred American servicemen had either drowned or frozen to death in the sea off the South Devon coast, many weighed down by the heavy equipment they'd been wearing at the time their ships had sunk, but still more killed, as the life preservers they'd wrapped around their waist incorrectly inflated, turning them upside down in the water and drowning them. As the full scale of the tragedy sank in, rather than react with compassion, the thoughts of the US commanders in charge of the operation turned instead to damage limitation. Those lucky enough to have survived and been brought ashore were immediately segregated away from the wider invasion force and sworn to secrecy. The main question asked of the planners was not how this had allowed to be taken place, but instead, what risk there was of the invasion plans having fallen into the hands of the enemy. It was confirmed amongst those on the lost American ships there had been 10 intelligence officers, all of whom held what was known as bigot level clearance. This meant that these men had been personally briefed on the actual locations of Operation Overlord, which could jeopardize the whole operation if they had been captured by the Germans. When it was established that none of these men were amongst the survivors, orders were given for a widespread search of Lyme Bay. This search would take several days, until it was confirmed that all of the bodies of the missing 10 men had successfully been recovered. Amongst the recriminations of both the US and the British naval staff, it was widely agreed there had been severe flaws in the overall planning and the execution of Exercise Tiger. No one individual would ultimately be reprimanded or held to account, and the matter was instead quietly brushed under the carpet in order for the invasion to go ahead. Instead, the focus was shifted onto using the learning points of the tragedy to modify the standing orders of the invasion itself. On the day of the attack, the E-boat pens on the French ports were designated to be bombed by the RAF in order to try and minimise the risk of a Kriegsmarine counterattack. Allied troops also underwent a wider programme of additional life jacket training, emphasising the dangers of wearing the devices incorrectly. There would also be an elimination of the use of separate radio frequencies and the deployment of small boats to the invasion fleet in order to recover soldiers who had been lost in the water. The twin disasters of Exercise Tiger would result in nearly 800 young Americans being killed before any had even set foot on the European mainland. This number would result in 4 times the amount of casualties that would actually be sustained on the morning of Operation Overlord in the attack on Utah Beach. The losses of those who participated in Operation Overlord were no doubt diminished by the lessons learned, but arguably this is a price that was too high, that should have resulted in the sanction and the punishment of those who had not only allowed it to happen, but also took efforts to hide it from the wider world.